Okay, let's see. Number 14, the jar that might be a battery. Your fingers come away tacky with ancient bitumen. In your palm sits a clay jar no taller than a hand, dug from the area of Kujut Rabu near Baghdad. Inside it, a copper tube hugs an iron rod, like parts of a device assembled for a purpose you can almost guess. Pour in something acidic, vinegar, grape juice, and modern replicas whisper to life with a faint voltage. The seduction of the so-called Baghdad Battery is immediate. History seems to have slipped, and a machine appears where no machine should be. But the deeper you stare, the stranger it gets. There are no secure wires, no verified electrical tools, no electroplated objects conclusively tied to these jars. So what are you holding? A miracle object centuries ahead of its time, a simple artifact we have overread, or the last surviving clue that an entire ancient industry has vanished almost without a trace. The machine that works in the lab but disappears at the crime scene. In 1938, Wilhelm Koenig, a German working at the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, looked closely at one of these jars and saw more than a container. He saw a system. The vessel was roughly 15 centimeters high. Its mouth had been sealed with bitumen. Inside sat a rolled copper cylinder, and down its center ran an iron rod. The copper was joined with a lead-tin alloy. To Koenig, that did not look random. It looked built. Once you see it that way, the object almost performs the explanation for you. Two different metals, a sealed ceramic body, space for a liquid. Put in an acid and the chemistry starts. Modern replica cells have produced about 0.4 to 1 volt, depending on the electrolyte and setup. Not much. But not nothing. So the myth writes itself with alarming speed. An ancient battery, probably Parthian or early Sasanian, waiting nearly 2,000 years for someone to top it up and wake it. Koenig went further. He suggested that jars like this may have powered electroplating, perhaps laying a thin coat of gold onto silver. Suddenly, the little pot is no longer a curiosity. It is an outlaw machine, appearing centuries before Volta. But the whole case hangs on a piece that is not there. If the iron rod sat inside the copper cylinder, and a current could form in liquid, what connected that current to anything outside the jar? That absence sounds small, until you try to make the object do real work. In the lab, the setup is easy. You add vinegar or grape juice. You attach wires. You link one cell or several. The voltage appears because modern hands finish the circuit. On March 23, 2005, Mythbusters aired a test using multiple replica jars and got the effect everyone wanted to see: ancient-looking batteries producing current. It was good television because the meter moved. It was bad archaeology if the moving meter became the conclusion. Archaeologists were asking a different question from the start. Not, could it work? Was it meant to? That is where the evidence thins out fast. No secure wires were found with the jar, no clear terminals, no workshop bench with a row of cells, no written instruction explaining electrical use, and the electroplating claim, which gives the battery story its glamour, has never landed cleanly. Ancient gilding existed, but no firmly linked set of electroplated objects closes the loop back to these specific jars from near Baghdad. The copper and iron arrangement can produce current. That part is physically plausible. The leap from plausible chemistry to proven ancient machine is where the floor starts to slide. There is another complication, and it cuts both ways. These jars do not stand entirely alone. Similar jar and metal arrangements have been reported from Mesopotamian sites including Seleucia and Ctesiphon. That helps the believers because it makes the object look less like a one-off oddity and more like a known type. But it helps the skeptics too, because known types in archaeology are not automatically machines. They can be ritual objects, storage objects, containers with a use we no longer recognize because the labels, the tools, and the everyday context are gone. Context is the whole trial here. A real battery is rarely just a vessel with potential. It belongs to an apparatus. It lives among other parts: leads, contacts, repeated setups, objects visibly altered by the current it supplied. Take those away and the jar becomes maddeningly bilingual. It can speak chemistry to a modern engineer and still speak something completely different to an archaeologist. You can feel why this object became famous. It flatters a very specific hunger. We want the ancient world to surprise us with forbidden precision, to slip an electrical device into an age of empires and caravans and bitumen-sealed ceramics. And sometimes that hunger is rewarded. Sometimes an impossible object really is the surviving clue to a much larger lost industry. But this one keeps stopping just short of confession. The iron rod is there. The copper cylinder is there. The bitumen seal is there. The voltage is there if we finish the job ourselves. What is missing is the step that turns a reactive jar into a demonstrated machine. Not a dead end, not a solved case, a gap with hardware in it. So the Baghdad Battery survives in a strange state between myth and evidence. It is not nonsense. The chemistry is real. It is not proof. The archaeology is thin. If one ancient machine looks impossible, this is the cleanest way the problem begins. A device that behaves in reconstruction, but arrives from the ground without the one thing that would tell us what it was for. No wire, no terminal, no securely documented connector. Number 13. The bronze object with no instructions. On a June day in 2023, in Trench 4 at Brill's Farm, near Norton Disney in Lincolnshire, a volunteer lifted a small bronze object from the fill. It looked engineered, yet gave up no clue to its use. It was a Roman dodecahedron, hollow, 12-sided, each pentagonal face cut with a circular hole of a different size, each corner finished with a knob. The shape announced planning. The silence around it was the shock. The holes are what turn surprise into a harder problem. One opening could be incidental. 12 openings, each sized differently, imply choice. More than that, they imply a system. A practical object built for repeated use should leave some trace of that system in its measurements, in matching examples, or in written instructions. A symbolic object might permit more freedom. This one sits in between. The arrangement feels exact, but no ancient text names it. No workshop guide explains it, and no image shows anyone using one. The first mystery is not that the object is strange. It is that it looks like something a Roman world full of habits, trades, and records should have explained. That is why Richard Parker, secretary of the Norton Disney History and Archaeology Group, treated the find itself as more than another example. Most Roman dodecahedra are discovered loose, stripped from the setting that might have told us whether they belonged in houses, shrines, workshops, or military spaces. This one was not. It appeared in situ, in a pit or quarry feature with 4th century Roman pottery around it, placed there roughly 1,700 years ago. A sealed context should narrow the debate. It should tell us whether we are looking at rubbish, storage, loss, or offering. Instead, it raises the stakes. The dodecahedron was not simply dropped and forgotten. It was put there, and even that stronger clue still does not say why. By now, that failure starts to matter. Across the northwestern Roman provinces, especially Gaul, Britain, and the Rhineland, more than 100 dodecahedra are known, with about 33 from Roman Britain alone after this discovery. 100 examples ought to be enough to force a pattern into view. If these were gauges, sighting devices, or tools with a fixed task, repeated finds should pull their dimensions towards standardization. Yet while the form remains unmistakable, the measurements drift. The count increases confidence that they belong to a real category, not a one-off curiosity. At the same time, that same count deepens the trap. A recognized class of objects circulated for generations, and still the function refuses to settle. The alloy tightens it further. XRF analysis by Jerry McDonnell gave the Norton Disney example a chemical profile of about 75% copper, 7% tin, and 18% lead. Lead-rich bronze casts well, which helps explain the crisp complexity of the form, but it also means choice. This was not the cheapest possible way to make an anonymous trinket. Someone invested skill and material in an object whose 12 faces, unequal holes, and corner knobs had to come out right. That does not prove high status or sacred use by itself. It does show that the design mattered enough to reproduce carefully, which makes the missing explanation harder to excuse as simple accident or improvisation. The local landscape adds another pressure point. In 1989, detectorists found the Norton Disney Rider God, a Romano-British figurine from the same broader area. That does not convert the dodecahedron into a ritual object. What it does is remove the comfort of assuming an ordinary tool dropped into ordinary soil. This was a place where Roman material culture met local practices, where offerings and identities could take forms that no surviving text bothered to record. The in situ context should have helped decide the issue. Instead, it only tells us that the final act was deliberate. If the dodecahedron was deposited, that may reflect ritual, retirement, concealment, or some practical sequence now lost with the custom itself. That is where interpretation becomes dangerous, rather than merely speculative. Call it a machine too quickly, and every hole turns into a modern guess about measuring, ranging, knitting, or calibration. Call it ritual too quickly, and precision gets dismissed as if symbolic objects had no need for strict form. The Norton Disney find blocks both escapes. The object is too carefully made, too repeatedly attested, and too deliberately placed to wave away. Yet context, count, and metallurgy still stop short of naming the action that once made the shape obvious. And that is the sharper loss this small bronze thing exposes. Roman provincial life is often reconstructed from durable remains, on the assumption that enough examples will eventually explain themselves. Here, the opposite may be true. More than 100 finds have established the category. A sealed 4th century context has shown purposeful deposition. The alloy shows controlled manufacture. None of that restores the vanished practice that made the object intelligible. The risk is not just that one tool or cult item remains unidentified. It is that a whole piece of practical or ritual knowledge could pass through a literate empire, spread across provinces, be made again and again, and still disappear so completely that even the best contexted find only proves what was not missing. The missing part was never the bronze. It was the use around it. Number 12. The Portable Sky. On July 4, 1999, on the Mittelberg Hill near Nebra in Saxony-Anhalt, 2 illegal metal detectorists dug up the bronze sky disk that may have turned heaven into a schedule. They expected a hoard, maybe a weapon, maybe coins. Instead, they pulled out a disk about the size of a dinner plate, green with corrosion, broken at the edge, and marked with gold that still caught the light after thousands of years. At first glance, it seems almost readable without explanation. A crescent, a round sun or full moon, scattered stars. But one tight cluster stands apart, and that cluster matters because it is usually identified as the Pleiades. Why isolate those points so carefully unless they helped answer a question people could not afford to get wrong? In farming societies, missing the right window for sowing or harvest did not mean mild inconvenience. It meant hunger, wasted labor, emptied stores, and the kind of failed season that could push a settlement into debt, raiding, or dependence on whoever still had grain. The sky was not decoration. It was timing, and timing could decide who ate through winter. The disk is only about 31 to 32 centimeters across, thin and portable, yet heavy enough at roughly 2,050 grams to feel substantial in the hands. That changes the picture immediately. It was small enough to be carried to a hilltop, a gathering, or a ritual site, but heavy enough to command attention once revealed. Not jewelry, not a casual plaque. An object built to appear, disappear, and reappear at the right moment. Its gold inlays form stars, a crescent, and a larger round body, with later additions around the rim. At least 38 holes were punched through the edge, and those holes are one of the clearest signs that the disk did not simply lie still as a prestige object. It was fixed to something, mounted, carried, or otherwise put into repeated use. 38 points of attachment means stability. This was made to stay in place while someone demonstrated it, transported it, or displayed it before others without letting the message shift. Wear and alteration matter here more than inventory. The disk was handled because its meaning had to work on command. That is where the story turns. This object was not made in one finished artistic moment. It changed. And the changes suggest that its users were adjusting not just an image, but a system whose errors could spread outward into fields, storehouses, meetings, and obligations. First came the sky symbols, then came the horizon arcs, the gold bands, often interpreted as marking the span of the sun's rising and setting points at this latitude between solstices. Then a lower arc was added. Then the edge was pierced, hole after hole, as if the disk had been attached for display or practical handling. One of the side arcs was later removed before burial. That sequence compresses years, maybe generations, of rethinking. Someone revised this thing because the knowledge on it mattered enough to update, and an update implies a prior version that was no longer sufficient. If people were using the disk to coordinate planting, festivals, travel, or tribute, then a wrong reading was not just embarrassing. It could put labor in the fields too early, bring people to gathering places after supplies had run thin, or send traders and herders onto routes at the wrong season. That matters because the Nebra disk is commonly dated to around 1600 BCE, while the accepted museum interpretation places its making earlier, around 1800 BCE, with a long period of use before burial. Those centuries are not neutral catalog range. A long life means the object stayed important through changing hands, memories, and conditions, surviving because communities kept needing whatever authority it carried. It was found with 2 bronze swords, 2 axes, 2 arm rings, and a chisel, a burial set that shifts the interpretation away from a casual tool and towards something bound up with status, authority, or controlled expertise. Weapons beside it raise the stakes beyond symbolism. If the disc helped decide the proper time for labor, gathering, offerings, or seasonal movement, then whoever controlled it could also decide who was late, who was impious, who had violated order, and who could be punished under that claim. On the 23rd of February 2002, police in Basel recovered the disc in a sting after it had moved through the black market. By then, the looters' spade marks were part of the evidence too. The object had been dragged from the ground, sold, mishandled, argued over, and nearly lost as a legal case before it was fully secured as an archaeological one. Even in the present, control over the disc meant control over its story. That parallel is hard to ignore. Once detached from context, the object becomes easier to sell, harder to verify, and far more useful to whoever wants authority without accountability. If the disc is genuine, then somebody in Bronze Age Europe was doing more than observing the sky. They were compressing astronomy, metallurgy, exchange, and social power into one object. Scientific analyses have suggested that some of the gold may have come from regions such as Cornwall, while the copper has been argued to match ore sources in or near the Eastern Alps, though both provenance questions remain debated rather than settled. Even so, those distances matter because they imply dependence. A disk assembled from far-reaching networks was not cheap local experimentation. It was an investment that tied specialist knowledge to elite access. If the materials had to be gathered across long routes, then damage, theft, or loss would not be easy to replace. The object's failure could become political. If the calendar keeper lost credibility, the network behind that authority might crack with it. The practical use may have been calendar regulation. The Pleiades are small, easy to miss, but in many ancient traditions their appearance and disappearance helped mark seasonal turning points. The arcs on the disk may reflect the solar horizon span relevant to the place where it was used. Read together, those features suggest a guide for reconciling lunar and solar cycles, for knowing when an extra month, a ritual correction, or a shift in communal timing was needed. And that is where the stakes sharpen. A drifting calendar does not just inconvenience a village, it can desynchronize planting from rainfall, offerings from expected celestial signs, and regional meetings from the brief windows when roads, rivers, or mountain passes remain usable. One bad correction could turn shortage into panic. Repeated bad corrections could make a leader look false, a rite look powerless, and a whole order of obedience look breakable. This is why the repeated modifications matter more than the object's beauty. A beautiful object can symbolize power. A corrected object can fail publicly if its correction no longer works. The holes suggest handling. The added arcs suggest calibration. The burial with weapons and prestige goods suggests restricted ownership rather than common access. Taken together, the disk looks less like a general image of the heavens and more like controlled knowledge made visible, something a specialist, leader, or ritual authority could present at the crucial moment and say, now. And if that reading is even close to right, the most unsettling implication is not that Bronze Age people tracked the stars. It is that a community may have tied survival to a single, portable model of the sky, revised by a few hands, trusted by many more. If that model drifted, if its keeper lied, or if rival groups claimed a different reading, the danger was no longer only mistimed harvests. It was fracture, competing calendars, broken gatherings, failed obligations, and the moment when people realized that the heavens they had been obeying might have belonged to someone else. Number 11. The Night Clock. In Edfu, around 600 BCE, an inscription links a remarkably plain instrument to a priest astronomer named Bes, son of Concertus, a bronze bar, a sighting piece, and a plumb line hanging in the dark. By daylight, Egypt already had shadow clocks and water clocks, but this device belonged to the hours after sunset, when there was no shadow to trust and no bright horizon cue to settle a line at a glance. If a ceremony had to begin at the proper point in the night, or if observers needed to establish a dependable celestial line before work on the ground, someone still had to make the sky answer in usable terms. This was the plumb line that made the night submit to a test. How did builders, priests, and surveyors find direction before compasses existed? How did they keep a wall straight, align a temple, or time a rite when the sun was gone and the ground offered no obvious guide? The merkhet was one answer attested in Egyptian practice. What survives does not prove every use later attributed to it in every setting, but it does show a method, a line, a site, and a trained observer waiting for a star to cross. On any project where the first line mattered, that beginning carried unusual weight, because stone preserves decisions long after the decision-maker is gone. A merkhet worked with a second piece, often described as a V-shaped palm rib, and together they turned the sky into a measuring surface. You held the line. You watched a chosen star cross it. The instant that star slipped through that narrow vertical path, you had an observed event that could serve as a reference. In some contexts, such a transit may have helped establish a north-south line. In others, it could mark a moment within the night. What matters here is not a grand claim for everything the instrument always did, but the discipline it required. The reading depended on a specific crossing that could be checked, repeated, taught, and disputed. That sounds simple until the consequences arrive. A few degrees at ground level can grow into a wall that drifts, an axis that wanders, or a sanctuary that sits awkwardly against the terrain or against a planned sightline. In sacred architecture, the cost was not only practical. A temple intended to engage a celestial event might miss its target. A rite tied to a watched star might begin under the wrong sign. A decorated ceiling that presents ordered heaven could end up preserving a human misreading instead. In a foundation trench, or a chamber cut for eternity, error does not fade with the night that produced it. It hardens into the project. That is why the surviving Edfu merkhet matters. It is late, around 600 BCE, from the 26th dynasty, now in the Science Museum collection, and each fact changes what we can infer. Because it is later than the Great New Kingdom monuments, it suggests continuity. This was not a one-time improvisation from a heroic building age, but a practice still worth preserving many centuries on. Because the object survives, we are not dealing only with pictures or literary description. We can see how little material separated confidence from doubt. A modest bronze instrument, associated by inscription with a named specialist, implies a world where crucial observations could rest on portable tools, and on the authority of the person using them. The logic behind the instrument is older. In Senenmut's tomb, TT 353 at Deir el-Bahri, around 1500 BCE, the celestial ceiling divides the night into structured sections, almost a working schedule for the sky itself. The gap between about 1500 BCE and 600 BCE matters because it hints at endurance across centuries of political change, temple rebuilding, and inherited training. If a system for organizing the night remains legible over that span, then observers were not merely admiring stars, they were maintaining knowledge. And the 24-part scheme was demanding. To divide darkness that finely, someone had to know which stars belonged to which interval, when they rose or crossed, and how seasonal change altered the sequence. This is where the object stops being a curiosity and starts looking like infrastructure. Bronze with electrum inlay, a plumb bob hanging straight down. A sighting tool that uses gravity to fix a vertical line, no hand can improve by wishful thinking. In the grip of an astronomer priest, the sky became something to interrogate. The instrument may have helped identify direction. It may have helped observers call segments of the night. It certainly belongs to a practice in which the heavens were read through repeated acts of alignment, rather than broad intuition. But the method carried a danger of its own. It depended on specialists, and specialists can fail or disappear. Not just any observer could do this well. Someone had to know which stars to use, when they were reliable, how to compensate for season and horizon conditions, and how to hold a line steady in darkness without inventing certainty where none existed. A tired watcher, haze, a poor star choice, or an old scheme copied by students who no longer understood its assumptions could all shift the result. Once that happens, the problem is larger than one bad night. A mistaken procedure can become institutional habit, then architectural inheritance, then a pattern repeated on later buildings because precedent now looks authoritative. That overturns a familiar picture of ancient orientation as rough alignment by sunrise or broad instinct. The evidence points instead to repeated observation, a hanging plumb line, a sighting piece, selected stars, and a practiced eye waiting for a crossing. A monument that seems immovable by day may have begun with an event so brief it could be missed in a blink. And if the method was copied across generations, the real stakes widen. What is preserved is not only a line on the ground, but a chain of teaching, memory, and trust. The object in the museum is small, but the system behind it reaches across centuries into tomb ceilings, temple planning, and labor carried out in darkness by people whose judgments were difficult to reverse. One observed crossing could guide a watch, support a ritual schedule, or contribute to orientation work. That is the unsettling part. So much could depend on a sequence that leaves almost no trace of its own. The chosen star, the clear horizon, the trained observer, the handed-down scheme, the instant of crossing. If any link in that chain failed, the sky did not keep the mistake, the ground did. Number 10. The stone that points. 3.4 centimeters. That is all the stone gives you at first. A flattened little bar of iron oxide, small enough to rest across 2 fingertips, small enough to look harmless in a tray. Put a magnetized piece like that on a splinter of wood. Lower it onto still water. It swings, then settles, north to south. In 1973, during a humid field season at San Lorenzo in Veracruz, Michael D. Coe excavated an early Olmec object, later catalogued as M160. San Lorenzo was no marginal village. It was one of the great Olmec centers, active across the long span of a civilization usually placed between 1500 and 500 BC. Basalt heads, planned earthworks, elite goods, labor on a scale that still looks expensive. And in that world of monuments and worked stone, this much smaller thing turned up, oblong, polished, made of iron ore, and magnetically strange in a way that did not fit neat museum labels. The argument starts there, not with a ship, not with a manual, not with an inscription saying this points north. It starts with a test in water, and with a harder question underneath it. Did the ancient maker care about the same property modern researchers care about? Or are we projecting an instrument onto a stone that simply happens to cooperate? In the years that followed, John B. Carlson studied the object closely and pushed the case further than most archaeologists were comfortable going. He did not claim a precision navigator's compass in the medieval sense. His language was more careful, which made it more provocative. He called it a plausible, zeroth-order compass, and raised the possibility that it might even count as a first-order one. The distinction matters. A zeroth-order compass is not a dial with a needle and marked bearings. It is simpler than that, a magnetic object deliberately used to reveal a preferred direction. Crude, yes, but direction finding does not need elegance to begin. Carlson's case rested on a few stubborn details. The San Lorenzo piece was not just magnetic, it was shaped, it was polished. Later descriptions give its length at about 3.4 centimeters. Crucially, it has a form that lends itself to testing, including flotation and alignment. If all anyone had found was a random magnetite lump, the story would have died as a cabinet curiosity. A worked bar that behaves in a repeatable way is harder to dismiss. It begins to look less like an accident and more like a possible choice. In 1976, the claim reached a wider audience when a brief note in Nature amplified the possibility. The San Lorenzo artifact, it said, had been thoroughly examined, and it suggested the object may have been made for compass use. A very small sentence, a very large blast radius. If M160 was intentionally exploiting magnetism, the timeline does not merely shift by adding an odd precursor to the compass. It would force a revision in what the Olmec could measure, standardize, or authorize. A device that can repeatedly indicate a preferred direction is not only a curiosity, it is a potential aid for laying out buildings, fixing ceremonial axes, or granting priests and elites a repeatable way to declare where the world is ordered. That is why the wider material record matters. Mesoamerica had a real lapidary tradition in magnetic and reflective minerals: magnetite, hematite, ilmenite, pyrite. Maya sites alone have yielded hundreds of mirrors. One survey counted over 500 archaeological specimens. That number cuts both ways. On one hand, polished iron ore mirrors were not geological accidents. They were manufactured objects, shaped by people who knew these materials well enough to grind them, polish them, and value their unusual properties. On the other hand, if hundreds of such objects survive, and none clearly preserve a compass system, a marked support, or an undeniable directional kit, the silence becomes damaging. The more extensive the mineral tradition looks, the harder it is to explain why a practical magnetic technology leaves almost no unmistakable trail. Skeptics step in there, and their objection is not trivial. Familiarity with magnetite does not prove directional intent. A mirror tradition is not a navigation tradition. Ritual specialists may have valued these stones because they were dark, reflective, rare, or symbolically charged. An object can be carefully shaped and still not be a tool in the modern functional sense. It can be ceremonial. It can be divinatory. It can be a prestige item whose magnetic behavior was noticed without being operationalized into a method. But the stakes rise in the second half of the argument, because accepting M160 as intentional would spill beyond one artifact. It would suggest that magnetism was not merely encountered, but selectively exploited, centuries before the better-known Old World compass traditions. That would reopen old questions about site orientation in Mesoamerica. Whether some alignments thought to be astronomical, topographic, or symbolic might also involve magnetic reference. It would also sharpen a political question inside ancient society itself. If direction could be demonstrated by a special stone, then control over that stone, who owned it, who interpreted it, who used it in planning or ritual, could become a form of authority. M160 would stop being just an isolated bar and start looking like evidence for a hidden practice of measurement. And yet the counterweight remains severe. Where is the rest of that practice? No marked housing, no text, no image of use, no secure context linking such an object to survey work, route finding, or a workshop sequence of similar pieces. Archaeology is full of plausible first steps that never become systems. A single convincing effect is not the same as a documented technology. So, M160 stays on the border. Ritual stone, polished artifact, experimental device, or the fragment of a directional tradition that failed to leave a clear archive. Put it back on the water, and the result stays the same. The magnetic property is real. The alignment can be demonstrated. What remains unproven is the missing second object, the support, the paired bar, the context piece from a layout, shrine, or workshop that would show this was not just a stone that points, but part of a method. And if that second piece ever appears in the wrong century, the whole accepted timeline for who learned to make direction, obey a tool changes with it. Number 9. The surveyor's engine. The sighting instrument that vanished as an object, but not as a practice. Most ancient machines announce themselves by surviving in metal. The dioptra does not. That is, the danger at the center of its story. Remove a reliable way to set lines, transfer angles, and hold level across rough ground, and entire works begin to look like luck after the fact. Keep the works but lose the tool, and later viewers can mistake a disciplined engineering tradition for isolated brilliance. The Greek dioptra belongs to the unglamorous layer of technology that makes ambitious construction possible. Not a theater automaton, not a prestige mechanism, a sighting instrument for fixing direction and elevation before labor becomes irreversible. In open country, a small angular error is already a problem. Underground, or across long distances, that error compounds. A line that drifts slightly at the surface can force costly correction chambers later, or leave crews cutting rock in the wrong place while the budget disappears into spoil. Its basic geometry, in one widely discussed form, was compact. One disc, two diameters engraved at right angles, one pivoted sighting bar, or alidade, mounted at the center. Hang it vertically from a ring, and gravity gives you a plumb reference. Set it for horizontal sighting, and it serves leveling work. In simpler reconstructions, it is almost offensively plain. No grand frame, no hidden power, just axis, angle, and a repeatable line of sight. It is safer to say not that the dioptra was universally the Greek standard, but that surviving technical traditions treat it as a central member of the Greek surveying toolkit. That distinction matters. The evidence does not support one single settled form used everywhere. What it does support is a family of sighting instruments used for practical measurement, the kind of devices roads, waterworks, boundaries, and tunnels quietly depend on. Ancient alignment on that scale is not maintained by intuition. The text that keeps this family visible is Heron of Alexandria's dioptra, usually placed in the 1st century AD. Its importance is not the catalog label attached by modern databases. Its importance is the alternative. Without Hero's treatise, the dioptra would have to be inferred almost entirely from the works that required such measurement and from later descriptions. Hero gives the missing middle layer at least one surviving voice, a technical author concerned with field problems, layout, levels, and procedures that become expensive the moment a measurement wanders. That practical voice comes with a complication. Hero's instrument was probably not the only dioptra, and may not have been the normal one. Scholarship has long suggested multiple forms. His version may represent a more elaborate redesign, built onto an older, simpler tradition. Perhaps an improvement for specialists. Perhaps an ingenious branch that was documented precisely because it was unusual. The best described dioptra in the record may be the least typical one in the field. Then comes the real loss. No actual ancient dioptra has yet been securely identified. That absence raises the stakes beyond mere curiosity. When the hardware disappears, the whole system risks being misread. Precision survives in aqueduct gradients, tunnel alignments, and planned turns, but the ordinary instrument that made such control routine drops out of sight. Bronze is melted down, wood rots. Workshop tools are repaired, reused, stripped, and gone. What remains are instructions in a text and consequences in stone. Even the simpler device could govern a demanding sequence of work. The cross diameters gave a built-in reference. The pivoted sighting rule let the surveyor swing that reference onto a target. The hanging orientation established vertical. Adjusted use produced horizontal sighting for leveling. No lenses are required for the basic principle. Surveying does not begin with magnification. It begins with repeatable orientation and the discipline to transfer it from station to station without drift. Picture that chain of operations on a real site. One point fixed, then another. A line carried across broken terrain when the destination is not always visible in one glance. Angles transferred. Offsets recorded. Elevation checked against what the project can tolerate. Corrections made while the mistake is still cheap. That is, the hidden economy of the instrument, not merely measuring well, but preventing error from hardening into masonry or disappearing underground. This is why the dioptra feels modern in the least romantic way. It belongs to a culture of work where failure scales brutally. In a ceremonial machine, failure means disappointment. In surveying, failure means wasted stone, lost labor, bad flow, misaligned cuts. And in tunneling, the possibility that two teams spend months carving toward a meeting that will never happen unless someone opens a correction chamber and salvages the plan. A famous example helps, but should stay in its place. On Samos in the 6th century BCE, the tunnel of Upalinos drove through more than a kilometer of rock, with two crews working from opposite ends. That achievement does not prove Hero's exact instrument was present there. It does show the kind of measuring culture under discussion: angular sighting, transferred alignment, level control, and deliberate correction rather than blind hope. The point is not to turn Samos into a miracle again. The point is that such works stop looking miraculous when a reliable survey tradition is allowed back into the picture. The picture still sharpens and blurs at once. We can outline what a dioptra did, but not reduce all Greek practice to a single surviving design. We can see the results with brutal clarity, yet not place a securely identified ancient example in a display case. That imbalance is the chapter's real tension. One of antiquity's most consequential instruments survives less as an artifact than as an engineering logic. So the dioptra's story is not the survival of a masterpiece. It is the near erasure of a trade's everyday intelligence. The visible monuments endured. The tool tradition that made them routine almost did not. And that may be the most important thing the instrument teaches. Before picks enter a hillside, before channels carry water, before a line of construction can look inevitable, someone has to establish a direction that others can trust. Number 8. The tunnel that met itself. Around 530 BC, on the island of Samos, an engineer named Eupalinos of Megara was asked to hide a city's lifeline inside a mountain. The spring lay outside the fortifications at Agiatis. The city lay beyond Mount Castro. Between them stood more than a kilometer of limestone. The water had to cross that barrier without revealing its source to anyone watching from outside. One tunnel would have been the obvious answer. Eupalinos chose something harder. The calculation was buried inside the mountain. He did not send a single crew into the rock. and wait for daylight on the far side. He opened 2 portals, one from the north and one from the south. Then he sent 2 teams toward each other through a mountain they could not see through. More than 1,000 meters of tunnel, a passage roughly 1.8 meters high and 1.8 meters wide. Men with picks, lines, marks on stone, measured lengths, and whatever geometric discipline could survive underground. If one impossible ancient machine is the last clue to a larger lost industry, this is the kind of clue it leaves behind. Not bronze teeth or polished dials. A result so precise it looks like luck until you measure it. Step into the problem. You are inside Mount Castro. The light is torchlight. The air is chalk and dust. Somewhere ahead, beyond hundreds of meters of rock, another crew is working from the opposite side. They cannot hear you. They cannot see your fire. If either line drifts too far east or west, the tunnels pass each other forever. If either team misjudges height, one heading cuts above the other and misses. A small error at the entrance becomes a permanent failure deep in stone. This tunnel was not just a hole in the mountain. It was a guidance system. Herodotus would later admire the work, and the numbers show why. The full main tunnel runs about 1,036 meters. One side accounts for roughly 612 meters. The other, about 424. North of the mountain, an additional conduit of around 850 to 900 meters brought water from the spring to the tunnel entrance before the mountain crossing even began. This was not only excavation, it was source protection, route planning, alignment transfer, grade control, and then the delivery of water into a defended city. One bad line would not just waste labor, it would leave Samos thirsty. The mountain did not offer clean geometry all the way through. The northern crew entered weaker rock. About 270 meters in, their heading bent west. On a diagram, that can look like a mistake. Inside the mountain, it may have looked like survival. Rock collapses do not care about elegant plans. The survey could not simply hold a perfect line. It had to hold a trusted line while adapting to bad ground. That bend changes what this machine looks like. Not a rigid instrument in one hand, but a system spread across a landscape. Sight lines outside. Baselines long enough to orient the portals accurately, measured intervals, marks on walls, repeated checks, corrections when geology pushed back. The intelligence was in the method. The method had to stay stable even when the path did not. By the time the crews approached each other, the tunnel did not resolve into a perfect arrow-straight meeting. The headings found each other with a vertical offset of about 50 centimeters, small enough to prove control, large enough to show the real conditions. Ancient surveyors were not magicians. They managed error. They did not eliminate drift. They contained it until breakthrough was still possible. Near the meeting zone, the line stops looking like blind faith and starts looking like strategy. Scholars have argued for years about the final bends. One interpretation, associated with Hermann Keenest, sees a planned catching arrangement, a deliberate zigzag near the breakthrough area that increased the odds that the two crews would intersect, even if the long-range alignment was slightly off. Later analysis has suggested a less theatrical, but equally impressive possibility. Some of those deviations may have been corrections introduced after accumulated surveying error, or after the northern crew's contact with weak rock forced them away from the ideal course. Either way, the picture is the same. The crews were not tunneling by hope, they were tunneling by control. Inside the finished work, the upper passage served as the walking tunnel. Below it, a deeper channel carried the actual water, with ceramic pipes laid along the lower course so the spring could flow into the city. That detail is easy to miss, but it shows how complete the design was. Eupalinos was not merely trying to meet in the middle. He was building a service corridor and a protected aqueduct at once, one nested inside the other, hidden in the mountain that shielded the city. The tunnel disappeared from common view for centuries. In 1853, Victor Guerin identified the first 400 meters of the aqueduct. In 1882, the monk Kyrillos Moninas pushed the investigation that located the main entrances again. Modern explorers did not find a legendary exaggeration. They found the stone record of an ancient calculation, preserved well enough to inspect. Stand in that passage now. The old impossibility changes shape. Two blind crews did meet inside rock, but not because they possessed some lost supernatural precision. They met because the plan expected drift, bad stone, and the need to recover from both. The bend in the north was not necessarily failure. The zigzag near the end was not necessarily confusion. In the quiet of Mount Castro, with one passage above and the water line cut below, the tunnel stops looking like a miracle object. It looks like something more revealing, a machine made of geometry, with the dogleg left in place as proof that someone expected error and built the correction into the mountain. Number 7. The Ancient Factory. In the 2nd century CE, just northeast of Roman Arles, engineers built something that still feels off at first glance. They took an aqueduct that could have fed fountains, baths, or fields, and drove it up a steep limestone slope at Barbagal, not toward a city center, not toward a palace, toward a hillside crowded with mills. The puzzle appears immediately. Why send water uphill to a work site instead of down to the city below? At Barbagal, the water was not there to be delivered. It was there to be used up. Gravity did the labor. Flow drove the system. The whole machine worked only if the water fell in the right sequence, one wheel after the next. The site lay about 8 kilometers northeast of ancient Aralat, modern Arles, at 43 degrees 43.28 minutes north, 004 degrees 43.17 minutes east. This was not some isolated rural mill. It was planned at industrial scale. Archaeologists identified 2 parallel descending rows of 8 mills, 16 water wheels in a single complex. One wheel passed water to the next below. Every drop had to work again, and then again, until the slope had nothing left to give. In the central working area, grain from the surrounding farms could be brought in, ground between paired millstones, and sent back out as flour. Scale changes the picture here. Estimates for output run from 4.5 to 25 tons a day, depending on the reconstruction. Even the low end is enormous for the Roman world. This was not a picturesque village mill. It was a factory before factories were supposed to exist. The geometry says the same thing in harder terms. The wheel pits measured about 1.1 meters wide and 4.9 meters long. The available head was only about 2.4 to 2.6 meters. That small drop favored overshot wheels, the kind that pull useful work from a tight vertical fall. So the builders did not waste the slope on one giant wheel. They broke the job into stages. They turned height into sequence. For centuries, the wood was gone. Only the masonry scars remained. The machine had vanished so completely that the ruins could be mistaken for something much less ambitious. Then, in 1937 and 1939, the archaeologist Fernand Benoit excavated the site. He recognized what he had in front of him, an aqueduct-powered flour mill complex. The bigger breakthrough came later, when the missing wood began to show itself through the stone. At the museum in Arles, researchers studied 142 carbonate fragments from Benoit's excavation. These were not gears, blades, or inscriptions. They were mineral crusts. They had formed on vanished flumes and wheels, preserving the wood as a negative mold. Of the 142 fragments, 93 were linked to mill-run flumes, 43 to water wheels, and 6 were too small or too uncertain to place confidently. Barbagal reveals itself through those fragments. The most informative evidence was not a surviving machine part. It was mineral scale. Calcium carbonate had kept the shape of things that no longer existed, layer by layer, as if the water had recorded the machine and then let the wood disappear. One fragment held an even sharper detail, regular saw marks, about 4.8 to 5.2 millimeters apart. In 2020, the team argued that this may be the oldest known evidence for mechanically sawn wood. Not hand-split timber, not rough carpentry, machine cutting. So the site was not just using advanced engineering. Advanced engineering had shaped the site itself. That is what makes Barbagal difficult to brush aside. The engineering is no longer the issue. Roman engineers built it. The harder question is the world around it. What kind of supply, labor, and coordination kept 16 wheels turning, 8 in one descending row and 8 in the other, while grain kept coming in and flour kept going out? The ruins still sit on the same slope, quiet and broken, with channels cut into stone. The logic remains. Water entered high, fell in sequence, and at the bottom, the last wheel waited in the dark. Number 6. The crank that changes everything. The crank arrived centuries too early. In the late 3rd century CE, in Hierapolis, a Roman spa city in Phrygia, a man named Marcus Aurelius Ammianos chose an unusual image for his sarcophagus. Not a banquet, not a god, not a victory scene. He had a machine carved into his tomb. At first glance, it looks simple. Water enters from one side, drops into a mill race, and turns a wheel. Beside it stand 2 upright frames pressed against rectangular stone blocks. But this relief is not just showing a workshop. It is trying to show motion, including the part you cannot see. The wheel is easy. Any Roman viewer would understand a water wheel. The harder part comes after it. How does turning become sawing? That is the puzzle inside a funerary image. A dead miller, or at least a man tied to milling, wanted this mechanism remembered after his body was gone. The machine itself is lost. What Hierapolis kept is a claim in stone. For a long time, that claim sat in plain sight. The sarcophagus of Ammianos was known. The relief was visible. But seeing is not the same as recognizing. Only centuries later did archaeologists and historians begin to read it for what it may be. One of the strongest surviving testimonies that Roman engineers had a water-powered stone sawmill using a crank and connecting rod system. Tullio Ritti, Klaus Grew, and Paul Kessener laid out that case in the Journal of Roman Archaeology in 2007. Their argument came from the carving itself. Look at what the relief shows. A wheel turned by flowing water. A gear train carrying that rotation onward. 2 frame saws, and between them, rods attached to rotating cranks. That last detail is why this tomb matters. A wheel gives rotary motion. A saw cutting a stone block needs reciprocating motion. Back and forth, stroke after stroke. Those are different movements. Something has to convert one into the other. On the face of this sarcophagus, that conversion seems to be the whole point. It sounds technical because it is. The leap is still enormous. When people picture ancient machines, they usually imagine direct force. Water turns a wheel turns a millstone. One rotation drives another. Clean, obvious, continuous. The Hierapolis relief points to a harder trick. Rotation is interrupted, redirected, turned into alternating push and pull. The blade moves forward, the blade pulls back, then forward again, then back, all under steady power. The material being cut was not wood in an ordinary village sawmill. The evidence points to stone, probably marble. In a city like Hierapolis, rich in stoneworking and monumental building, that makes the claim much bigger. Stone does not tolerate rough, irregular motion. It demands control. It demands repeatable strokes. If this relief shows what it appears to show, then the machine was not a novelty. It was a working solution to a serious industrial problem. That brings the larger issue into focus. When an ancient machine looks too advanced, what are we seeing? A miracle object? A bad reading of damaged evidence? Or the last surviving trace of a much larger lost industry? Ammianos cannot settle that alone, but he does make the lonely genius explanation harder to defend. Tombs do not usually advertise devices nobody around them would recognize. A funerary relief has to communicate. It tells other people who the dead man was. The image probably made sense in its own world. So what was Ammianos claiming? That he invented it? Maybe. That he owned it? Possibly. That his workshop used it, improved it, or profited from it. Any of those fits the evidence better than silence. But the relief does not say that much. It proves knowledge of the mechanism at Hierapolis in the 3rd century CE. It does not prove authorship. In that way, the document is frustratingly Roman, specific enough to change the timeline, not specific enough to satisfy modern curiosity. Still, the timeline changes. This is among the earliest known visual evidence for a crank and rod system used with water power. That phrase can sound dry, but the thing itself is startling. Later engineers would depend on the same basic conversion in pumps, engines, and machine tools. Here it is centuries earlier, on a sarcophagus in western Turkey, carved as if it belonged naturally in a respectable professional life. The mismatch is hard to miss. What survives officially is a funerary monument, a stone box for the dead. What survives in practice is one of the clearest mechanical testimonies the Roman world ever left behind. There is no iron crankshaft in a display case, no preserved saw frame, no workshop manual. There is only this carved image from Hierapolis, dated to the 3rd century CE, insisting quietly on a sequence of actions. A wheel turned, a rod pulled, and 2 saws moved back and forth through stone. So the invisible motion in the relief was not symbolic. It was the missing transformation itself. The crank system made a rotating world cut in a straight line. On Ammianos's tomb, a workshop still speaks from the grave. Number 5. The first vending machine. A man steps out of the heat and into the shade of an Egyptian temple. In his hand is a single coin. He does not give it to a priest. He drops it into a box. Metal strikes metal inside the housing. and a small measure of holy water begins to flow for ritual washing before he enters. In the 1st century CE, Heron of Alexandria described a device for exactly this job in Pneumatica, Book 1, Chapter 21. Not wine, not grain, holy water. A measured amount, released only when payment arrived. It sounds almost too modern at first. The logic is plain. A coin lands on a pan linked to a lever. The lever opens the valve, water runs, then the coin slips away, and the system closes itself. That is the part worth staring at. Heron is one of those names that keeps turning up whenever ancient engineering starts to feel uncomfortably advanced. Alexandria, Roman Egypt, 1st century CE. He wrote about pneumatics, automata, siphons, temple mechanisms, and devices that moved, hissed, opened, shut, and performed. Some were spectacle, some were demonstrations. This one sat where people came with a practical need. Before entering sacred space, worshippers wanted ritual washing. Temples needed a way to provide it. They also needed a way to keep every passing hand from taking it for free. So Heron turned purity into a transaction. Stand there for a moment. Incense in the air, stone underfoot, murmured prayer. Inside the wall, or beside the basin, a hidden mechanism waits for exact weight. A coin falls, and the machine decides that you have paid for the right to cleanse yourself. The consequence reaches beyond the valve itself. This is automated control inside a sacred space. It teaches the rule without a priest saying a word. It also shifts power in a subtle way. Access to ritual preparation no longer depends on a visible human judgment at the doorway. It depends on whether the institution has set the device, priced the measure, and kept the mechanism working. Modern reconstructions, including one described by Smith College, make the design easy to visualize. A coin drops onto a small pan or tray connected to a lever arm. Its weight pushes the arm down and briefly lifts or shifts a plug at the valve. Water is released from a vessel in a controlled amount. The pan is shaped so the coin cannot remain in place for long. As the system tilts, the coin slides off. Once its weight is gone, a counterweight or return force brings the lever back, shuts the valve, and prepares the dispenser for the next user. That self-resetting action is the real trick. A paid lock is easy to imagine. This is finer than that. It dispenses, limits, closes, and restores itself in one cycle. No attendant has to stand there watching for cheats. No worshipper can simply linger at the outlet and turn a trickle into a basin full. For a temple, that means discipline. One payment, one measure. The machine is part vending machine, part anti-theft device, part religious infrastructure. And that raises a sharper question than mere cleverness. Who controls ritual purity when access is rationed by hardware? The temple does. The price can be set. The amount can be reduced. The apparatus can be placed at the threshold and made to feel as natural as the doorway itself. If the mechanism jams, the queue stalls. If it is miscalibrated, some visitors receive too little water and others too much. If someone with authority alters the weight standard or the valve opening, the rule changes without any sermon, argument, or negotiation. The machine does not just save labor, it hardens policy. That points back to the larger question running through all of this. If one ancient machine looks impossible, what are we looking at? A miracle object, a misread artifact, or a surviving clue to a broader technical ecosystem? Heron's dispenser supports the third answer, but cautiously. A mechanism like this does not appear from nowhere. It assumes metalworking good enough for levers and fittings. It assumes containers that can hold and release water predictably. It assumes craftsmen who understand balance, return motion, and controlled flow. It assumes a temple economy that sees value in replacing a human hand with repeatable hardware. The usual mistake is to picture ancient automata as toys for rich people or trick devices for banquets. Heron certainly wrote about wonders. This one solved a real institutional problem. A basin of holy water left unattended invites waste, theft, and endless small arguments over who pays and who does not. A priest assigned to meter out every portion costs labor and creates friction at the entrance. A sealed dispenser avoids both. It makes the rule physical. Drop the coin, receive the measure, move on. The setting sharpens everything. In a marketplace, a coin machine would already be clever. In a temple, it becomes harder and more revealing. The machine stands between the body and ritual access. It enforces payment at the threshold of purity. If you arrived with devotion but no coin, the mechanism would not care. That indifference is part of its authority. It removes discretion from the person at the entrance, but it concentrates discretion earlier, in the hands that designed, approved, funded, and maintained the system. One frustration stays with the story. We know this device through Heron's description and through later reconstructions of what that description means in hardware. The basic principle is clear enough to rebuild, but the exact layout of the original temple installation has not survived in bronze and wood. No dispenser sits in a museum with its reservoir intact. No priest's inventory gives us the maintenance schedule. No repair notes tell us how often parts corroded, what happened when coins of the wrong weight were dropped in, or whether attendants had to intervene more often than the elegant design suggests. The machine is firm as an idea and slippery as an artifact. Even with that uncertainty, the central fact remains. Heron described a coin-operated dispenser for holy water in Roman Egypt. The design turns payment into a measured service without requiring constant human supervision. That is not decorative cleverness. It is automation with rules. Go back to the sound at the start. The coin lands inside the sealed device, metal on metal. A brief stream runs into the worshipper's hand. Then it ends, and the entrance keeps moving. The more unsettling question is what does not survive with it. If a temple could hide one reliable mechanism inside stone and ritual, how many others once managed doors, offerings, timings, or permissions without leaving an artifact behind? Heron's text may not be a lone curiosity. It may be the thin, visible edge of a wider culture of ancient automation that has almost entirely vanished. Number 4. The steam engine that went nowhere. In Alexandria, sometime in the 1st century CE, a metal sphere turns above a vessel of boiling water. No pistons, no wheels driving looms, no locomotive shrieking into a station, just a polished ball. Steam hisses from 2 bent tubes. The vapor shoots out sideways, and the reaction twists the sphere around. It is a tiny scene, almost delicate, yet it carries a brutal implication. The principle is right there. Heat is already being turned into motion. Why did this not start the industrial age? The surviving name attached to that question is Hero of Alexandria. In his pneumatics, he describes a sealed cauldron of water feeding steam into a hollow sphere. The sphere is mounted so it can rotate. 2 outlet pipes are bent at the ends. Fire heats the water. Steam rises. Pressure builds. The jets escape, and the sphere spins. A modern museum label at Smith College calls it what later generations are primed to see: the world's first steam engine. Technically, that label is defensible. You can build it. Heat goes in. Motion comes out. The machine works. But the phrase is also emotionally misleading because it invites viewers to expect the first step on a road toward factories and railways. The evidence does not support that road. Hero does not present it as the opening of a factory age. He places it among ingenious devices that show how air, fire, and water behave. These are devices that perform, devices that surprise. In his own framing, they create wonder. That shifts the whole feel of the object. The Aeola pile looks like prophecy when you stare at it from the age of railroads. Put it back in Roman Egypt, and the mood changes. Mechanics could serve temples, theaters, banquets, and elite display just as easily as production. The same civilization that could automate a measured stream of holy water could also make a spinning globe of steam and treat it not as the future, but as an elegant proof that nature could be coaxed into spectacle. Hero may not even have been first. Earlier still, Vitruvius, writing in De Architectura, mentions hollow Aeola piles to show that heat can generate a strong blast of air. The basic insight was already in circulation before Hero wrote it down. That matters. This is not the story of one impossible genius having a freak idea centuries too early. It is the story of a technical tradition that knew the principle, described the principle, and still did not build an economy around it. It is easy to see why later readers were hypnotized by it. In 1851, Bennett Woodcroft published an English translation of Hero's pneumatics. By the industrial 19th century, this little device looked uncanny, like an ancestor found out of time. A turbine-like object in Alexandria around 100 CE. Steam pressure, rotary motion, the outline of the future sitting in the ancient world. But shape is not enough. A spinning sphere is not yet a working engine in the industrial sense. It gives motion, but not obviously usable torque. It has no clear mechanism for control, endurance, or sustained transfer of force into a workload. No preserved ancient workshop setup shows it linked by shaft, gearing, or belt to a mill, pump, hammer, or saw. No surviving text from antiquity says this device was used to drain mines, power workshops, or replace animal labor at scale. One door stays open. Perhaps some practical use existed and vanished. But what survives points somewhere else, toward demonstration, toward learned amusement, toward engineered amazement. And this is where the danger of modern hindsight enters. Once later history has taught us what steam can become, we start grading earlier devices by their resemblance to the winners. A museum label, a textbook diagram, even a reconstruction on camera can quietly slide from "this converts heat into motion" to "this was basically an engine waiting for industry." That is too simple. It risks misclassifying a demonstration as a machine system and a principle as a program. Worse, it can erase a harder truth. Ancient technical knowledge did not only advance or fail. Sometimes it survived as display because display paid. Sometimes it remained marginal because no surrounding economy rewarded the ugly work of refinement. Stand beside it for a moment. The vessel below is hot enough to spit and tremble. The sphere above begins with a whisper, then a hiss. Then the little globe turns faster on its pivots, driven by invisible force. Steam is doing work in front of your face. Not metaphorically, literally. Heat becomes motion, and still, nothing like Manchester follows. A principle is not a system. Fire can spin a sphere. A factory needs much more than a clever conversion of energy. It needs metals that can tolerate long stress. It needs fuel networks that make heat cheap enough to waste. It needs machine tools that can produce durable parts in quantity. It needs economic pressure to substitute capital for labor. It needs a reason to keep improving one design until it stops being a wonder and starts being infrastructure. Ancient economies had labor, often very cheap labor. They had water power, where water power already solved the problem. They had craftsmanship, but not the full chain that turns a brilliant demonstration into a rugged prime mover used across mines, mills, and transport. That may be the harsher lesson here. If a device is admired but not economically necessary, refinement can stall. Knowledge can remain real, visible, even famous, and still fail to accumulate into a new regime of power. The Aeola pile survives in texts precisely because it was memorable. How many less theatrical experiments vanished because they were not copied, funded, or tied to a profitable task? So the unsettling question is not simply why one ancient steam engine did not trigger an industrial revolution. It is how many ancient machines reached the threshold of possibility, then stopped at spectacle because their world had no reason to drag them further. Number 3. The Bronze Dragon Alarm. Later accounts place the scene in 132 CE, somewhere inside the Eastern Han court. A bronze ball drops with a sharp metallic click. The room itself is said to have seemed calm. No wall cracks, no tiles slide loose, no one in the capital feels the ground move. Yet one of 8 dragon heads fixed around a large vessel releases its ball into the open mouth of the frog below. East, west, northeast, southwest. One direction has spoken. If the reports are even roughly true, something inside that bronze jar responded before any person in the room knew there was anything to feel at all. The man tied to that moment was Zhang Heng, born in 78 CE. Court astronomer, mathematician, engineer, poet. One of those figures who make a whole century seem more intelligent just by standing in it. He lived until 139, but the machine that carried his name furthest was not built merely to impress a banquet hall. It was meant to warn officials about violence happening far beyond sight. An earthquake you can feel is already here. An earthquake detected from a distance is news arriving before experience does. Later descriptions give the famous outline. A bronze, urn-like instrument, 8 dragons around the upper rim, one for each cardinal and intercardinal direction. 8 frogs beneath them, mouths open to receive the signal. When the hidden mechanism inside reacted to a seismic event, one ball fell from one dragon into one frog. No graph, no waveform, no wiggling needle scratching a record for a lab notebook centuries later. Just a verdict. There has been an earthquake, and it came from that direction. This machine sits in an awkward place between history and reconstruction. Its exterior sounds theatrical, almost too perfect. Bronze dragons, bronze frogs, a falling ball as the message. But the claim attached to it is colder than the decoration. The device was said to register a distant quake, even when people in the capital noticed nothing at all. If so, this was not a curiosity. It was a state instrument for sensing disaster beyond ordinary human perception. The story that fixed its reputation also comes to us through later accounts. The instrument signaled an earthquake to the west. No one in the capital had felt anything. Officials doubted it. Then news arrived. An earthquake had indeed occurred in Longxi, far away. Whether every detail of that scene reached us intact is another matter, because the original machine is gone, and the surviving descriptions are not eyewitness technical manuals. Still, the story survived for a reason. It preserved the kind of feat people believed Zhang Heng had attempted, a mechanism that turned distant ground motion into usable information. And Zhang Heng was exactly the kind of person who would try. At court, he worked in astronomy and calendrics, fields where the empire's authority depended on measuring motions too large, too slow, or too remote for casual observation. He studied heavens, time, alignment, patterns. So when the ground itself became the problem, he did not treat it only as a divine mood to be feared after the fact. He treated it as a physical event that mechanism might render legible. The audacity is easy to miss if you stare too long at the dragons. The important move was to assume that nature could be translated into signal, then folded into administration. You can see why later seismologists became obsessed with it. In the late 19th century, when modern earthquake science began building its own instruments, Zhang Heng's bronze vessel started to look less like an old anecdote and more like a predecessor. Researchers returned to the Chinese texts, looking for the first machine that tried to make invisible earth motion visible. But the rediscovery came with a built-in problem. They had the shell in description, not the heart in metal. So the debate moved inward, into the missing mechanism. Some reconstructions imagine a pendulum, others favor inertial masses and directional triggers, arranged so motion from one side would release one latch, and only one latch. In 1960, Toshio Asanuma and Iwao Sensui published a reconstruction study that later informed the Smithsonian replica. In 1983, AFP Holsewe? No, that is exactly the kind of confusion this topic attracts. A cleaner reference point is the later discussion by AFC Sleeswick and Nathan Sivan, whose article, Dragons and Toads, became a key modern touchstone in the debate. The arguments are technical because they have to be. Once the original device is lost, every confident explanation becomes part engineering and part disciplined guesswork. Picture the problem the builder had to solve. You need a vessel stable enough to stand in a court, a mechanism sensitive enough to react to ground motion, a trigger selective enough to release one ball in one direction, not all 8 in chaos. And it has to do this while the people watching may feel nothing. This is not a dramatic local jolt. It is a faint disturbance, too small for the body, but enough for bronze and balance to betray it. That is what ties the machine to the larger question, running through all these impossible objects. A lone artifact can always be treated as a miracle, a misunderstanding, or a story polished by retelling. Zhang Heng's seismoscope points to something larger, not just one gifted man, but a court culture with metalworking, conceptual confidence, and administrative reasons to build a device whose whole purpose was actionable information. An empire does not commission a large bronze alarm because it enjoys decorative frogs. It does so because distant disasters matter politically, financially, militarily. Grain routes fail, walls crack, tax districts collapse. A machine that hears bad news early has work to do. And yet the machine that made that promise is gone. No excavated original, no surviving internal assembly, no hidden core to settle the argument. What remains is the exterior described in texts, the reputation, the later reports, and the reconstructions that try to make the old description mechanically honest. The likeliest answer to the opening riddle is some kind of inertial trigger, a suspended or balanced mass that lagged as the vessel moved with the earth, released a directional catch, and dropped a single ball. But that answer is still a reconstruction, not a recovered fact. The harder question stays open. Did Zhang Heng's device truly work as a directional seismoscope, or are later readers and modern replicas making an ancient text sound more precise than the lost machine ever was? Number 2. The automatic crossbow. In Rhodes, sometime in the 3rd century BC, a siege engine appears in the record, doing something siege engines are not supposed to do. It does not wait to be cranked back, loaded by hand, aimed again, and fired as a sequence of separate jobs. In the later description preserved by Philo of Byzantium, it begins to feed itself. Reloading becomes part of the machine. Philo does not present it as a legend. He treats it as a technical device, built for the Rhodians, and very probably designed by Dionysius of Alexandria, an engineer from the city that had already become the Hellenistic world's great laboratory of geometry, metalwork, and applied mechanics. What he describes is not a giant battlefield monster. It is smaller, tighter, and stranger than that. A compact, repeating dart thrower, small enough to feel plausible, precise enough to feel wrong. A normal ballista had a rhythm everyone understood. Fire, stop, rewind the string, seat the next bolt, set the trigger, fire again. Human hands stitch the cycle together. Here, the cycle itself becomes the invention. One operator stands behind the frame and works the rear levers, or the windlass. As the mechanism moves, parts on both sides of the machine begin working together. The string is drawn back, a dart is selected. The lock engages, the release follows. Then it resets and does it again. Speed alone is not the unsettling part. Ancient armies knew how to fire quickly when crews were drilled well. The disruption is in the sequence. This machine appears to coordinate cocking, feeding, locking, and firing, so that one motion drives the next. A weapon built that way starts to look like more than artillery. It looks like evidence of a wider, mechanical language. The details make that clear. On each side of the case, in reconstructions and museum models based on Philo's text, sit paired pentagonal sprockets. Not decorative wheels, five-sided drivers, meshing with chains that run along the frame. Those chains are not modern steel bicycle chains. They are an iron and wood linked system connected by pins to a sliding carriage. Turn the mechanism and the carriage travels. As the carriage moves, the bowstring is hauled back against the torsion power of the weapon. Now stand behind it. Your hands are on the windlass. The frame shudders under load. In front of you sits a vertical magazine stacked with darts, each around 481 millimeters long in one modern reconstruction, nearly half a meter, long enough to kill, short enough to stack. You turn, and the machine does more than store energy. It controls the moment when the next projectile may enter the track. That is why this device keeps returning in histories of ancient engineering. Beneath the magazine, Philo describes a grooved roller. As the main motion continues, the roller turns at exactly the right moment and lets one dart drop into place. Not two, not the whole stack jamming into the firing path. One. Then the slider completes the draw. The trigger locks. The release comes. The dart is launched. The magazine waits above, held back until the cycle returns to the correct position. The old problem with repeating weapons was not force. Force was available. Portion artillery had been throwing bolts and stones for generations. The problem was timing. How do you make separate actions happen in the right order, without asking a crew to perform each one by hand? Dionysius's machine seems to answer with a mechanism that contains the order inside itself. Modern engineers have argued over exactly how this thing ran. Earlier reconstructions often required the operator to reverse the windlass during the cycle, back and forth, as if the machine needed human correction every few moments. But in 2010, in Mechanism and Machine Theory, Cesare Rossi and Flavio Russo published a reconstruction arguing for something cleaner and more alarming. Continuous rotation in one direction. Keep turning the windlass the same way, and the linked system handles the cycle by itself. If that reconstruction is right, then the repeating ballista is not just a clever loader. It is one of the earliest known weapons to use chain drive as part of an automatic firing sequence. Centuries before chain-driven machinery became familiar in later engineering, a Hellenistic arsenal may have been experimenting with linked drives, synchronized motion, and a feed system that behaves less like a catapult and more like a programmed machine. There is still a hard limit on how far that claim can go. The device survives in description, not as an excavated original. The attribution to Dionysius is strong, but not mathematically certain. Rossi and Russo call it very probable, not proven beyond argument. The battlefield question also remains. Was this weapon actually used on the walls of Rhodes, feeding dart after dart into a real siege? Or was it an arsenal prototype admired because it solved a mechanical puzzle better than it solved a military one? That uncertainty shapes the larger riddle running through these objects. One impossible artifact can be dismissed as a showpiece, a one-off trick, a machine built to impress a patron and then forgotten. But this ballista belongs to a world that already had torsion springs, precision frames, shaped metal fittings, and state money for military experimentation. It does not come out of nowhere. It comes from a workshop culture, already comfortable with parts that had to move in sequence or fail. So when Philo's descriptions start sounding too advanced, too coordinated, too close to later machinery, the text does not have to be fantasy. Hellenistic engineers may have been exploring a branch of mechanics we almost never get to see. Wood rots, iron is recycled, arsenal machines die at war or in scrap heaps instead of on protected seabeds. At the start, the impossible part was simple, a siege engine that seems to feed itself. Philo's answer is brutally specific. The operator turns from the rear. The paired pentagonal sprockets pull the side chains. The chains drag the slider. The slider draws the string. Under the magazine, the grooved roller rotates just enough to admit a single dart into the channel. The next shot is already moving into line when the frame snaps forward. Number 1. The Shipwreck Computer. On May 20th, 1902, in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, a cracked lump of green-brown bronze gave itself away with a single tooth. Spiridon Stias saw it in a box from the Antikythera wreck during processing. Contemporary accounts place the museum archaeologist Valerios Stias there as well. For months, it had looked like scrap hauled up with statues, glass, pottery, and corroded metal from a 1st century BCE shipwreck. Then the crust split just enough to show a gear, not decoration, not a hinge, a gear. The question sharpened at once. Was this an impossible one-off miracle, or the last surviving clue of a workshop culture that once made machines like this and then almost completely vanished? The wreck had entered the story 2 years earlier, in the spring of 1900. Sponge divers from Syme took shelter near the small island of Antikythera and found cargo on the seabed. Their report triggered the recovery of 1900 to 1901, often called the first major marine archaeological expedition. There was nothing romantic about it. 1 diver died. 2 were paralyzed. Men in heavy gear worked a deep, ancient debris field for bronze and marble. They brought up statues in pieces and luxury goods from a drowned shipment. So when a corroded bronze clump reached Athens in early summer 1901, nobody was waiting for a computer. They were unpacking a wreck. People love the version where genius strikes like lightning in a box. A miraculous object appears from nowhere, centuries ahead of its time, and history shrugs. The evidence points somewhere less comfortable. The surviving mechanism is now divided into 82 fragments. At least 30 bronze gear wheels survive. Fragment A alone preserves 27 of them. Those numbers matter because they make dismissal harder. 1 stray wheel could be an oddity. A cluster of matched gears, plates, scales, pointers, and inscriptions is a system. It was built in the 2nd century BCE and buried in a 1st century BCE shipwreck. Those dates pin it to the Hellenistic world, not to legend. For a long time, corrosion blurred almost everything. You could say it had gears. You could suspect astronomical functions. That uncertainty left room for miracle stories, because every hidden surface protected the idea that this was some freak exception. The decisive turn came from a new way of seeing. In 2005, microfocus X-ray computed tomography and advanced imaging looked through the crust instead of merely at it. Hidden teeth emerged. Internal arrangements became legible. Faint inscriptions, buried for 2,000 years, started speaking again. CT did more than sharpen the picture. It changed the argument. It showed that the sophistication was not being projected onto a ruin by modern enthusiasm. It was physically inside the ruin. What appeared inside was specific enough to raise the stakes. The mechanism modeled cycles of the moon and sun. It tracked calendars. It predicted eclipses. It pointed to the dates of major athletic games. This was not one impressive trick mounted for display. It was a compact package of linked functions, gears cut to ratios, scales laid out for reading, pointers translating calculation into movement, inscriptions explaining operation. That combination forces a harder question. If Hellenistic craftsmen could build this much precision into a portable instrument, what else could their workshops produce repeatedly that no longer survives? Once you admit one working device with this density of design, the silence of the record stops looking natural. It starts looking like loss on a system level. Picture it in the hand. Bronze plates, axles, pointers, dials, a box-sized device turning mathematics into motion. You rotate an input, Hidden gears translate that turn into different cycles moving at different rates. The sky becomes mechanism. The calendar becomes machinery. Eclipse prediction becomes something you can set, read, and carry. This is ancient people encoding observed patterns in metal, with enough confidence to make the result portable and usable. It was not a modern computer with electricity or silicon. It was something more dangerous to the old story, a geared calculating device whose mechanical relationships stood in for astronomical ones. And it looks too finished to be the first. Finished machines usually come late. They come after trials, mistakes, improved versions, trained hands, and shops where difficult work has become routine enough to repeat. That is the manufacturing implication hidden inside the romance. The Antikythera Mechanism is not just evidence of high theory. It is evidence of production knowledge. Tooth cutting, layout, casing, assembly, calibration, inscription, and the expectation that someone would know how to use the result. Even if only a few were made, a few already implies more than one mind and more than one attempt. There is still a human dispute at the center of the discovery. Who deserves primary credit for recognizing what sat in that museum box in 1902? Spiridon Stias, the public figure celebrated in newspapers, or Valerio Stias, the museum archaeologist who appears beside him in contemporary accounts? The dispute matters because the story keeps trying to collapse toward a hero. The mechanism resists that collapse. Its inscriptions imply instruction. Its gearing implies skilled predecessors. Ancient references to similar devices in the wider tradition suggest it was not conceptually alone. Yet almost none of that world is left. Bronze was melted down, wood decayed, instruments were broken, stripped, and reused. Shipwrecks preserved by accident, not by fairness. So the tooth in the cracked bronze did not simply solve a puzzle. It opened a larger absence. We can now see enough to know this machine belonged to a real technical culture, and enough to know that culture is mostly missing. Somewhere between the workshops that could cut these gears and the museum box in Athens, entire chains of practice disappeared. The tools, the training, the customers, the reasons to keep making such devices. The sharpest question is no longer whether one ancient machine existed. It is why no surviving industry remains around it at all, unless the Antikythera Mechanism is only the tooth of a much larger jaw, and almost every other piece was lost before history learned to look for it.